Hi guys, today I want to talk to you a bit about plosives. We are going to talk about 3 different types of plosives and then look at how to identify those in Praat. So let's start by looking at these 3 different types of plosives. As you see here, we've got voiced, voiceless, and aspirated. Now, you might think when looking at the IPA chart that voiced and voiceless seem obvious enough, that we should have a B and a P. B and P. However, the story is not quite so simple. And we can investigate why by thinking about what all plosives have in common. Namely, they explode open, thus the name plosives. They all have a burst. Yeah, and I have gone ahead and drawn a line in the middle of each of these that shows where the burst happens. Now, what else do all plosives have in common? Well, they also begin and end at some point. So where the phases of the plosives begin and end is what differentiates these 3. And namely, what we're going to look at is the voicing. So let's start with the simplest one, a voiceless plosive. It's nice and simple because before the burst, there is no voicing, and after the burst, there is voicing. So I'm going to draw a little mountainous voice bar here. Now, an aspirated plosive is pretty similar to a voiceless plosive. The voicing also begins after the burst, but it waits for a moment until after the burst, and we have just a release of air in silence. So I'll try to recreate the difference between these. The voiceless might sound more like pa, and the aspirated would sound more like pa. Pa, 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 pa. Now I'm over-exaggerating it a little bit so that you can really hear that pause of air after the burst. Pa. Obviously, in real-time speech, the voicing comes in much quicker, but you get the idea. Now, what option do we have left for the voiced? Well, in a voiced, the voicing comes in before the burst. The voicing happens before and after the burst. I guess technically during the burst as well. So, ba, it almost sounds like I'm saying a nasal before it. Ba, ba, pa. Ba, ba, pa. Ba, ba, pa. Or g, g, k. G, g, k. Now, what we also see here is that each of these has a voice onset time, and that voice onset time is a measure of the time between the burst and the voicing. Again, we start with the voiceless. It's the simplest. There is no time between the burst and the voicing. They happen at the same moment, so the voice onset time is 0 milliseconds. With aspirated, we wait a moment. Let's say, for our purposes, we wait, 0.05 seconds. Okay. Now, in a voiced, what are we going to do? Well, we do still have time between when the voicing begins and the burst happens, but this time it's going in the opposite direction. So we're going to make this negative 0.05. So the voice onset time for a voiced plosive will be negative. For a voiceless plosive, it will be 0. And for an aspirated plosive, it will be a positive number. Now, let's see if we can apply these same ideas when we're trying to identify plosives in Praat. So the first thing we will need to do is create an audio recording. I'm going to say Abba, Papa a few times because it should include a voiced, a voiceless, and an aspirated bilabial plosive. Aber Papa, aber Papa, aber Papa, aber Papa, aber Papa. Now you'll notice I said it a few times. That's because no matter how much you try to say something the same each time, it's always different. And sometimes those tiny differences make a big enough difference when you're trying to analyze something in Praat that for your own learning purposes, it's really good practice to record something multiple times and notice the difference. For example, I noticed that when I'm tired, I get a creaky voice and it makes everything look very wobbly in Praat. I'm sure we'll see it now. I'm going to create 2 tiers so we can annotate this. They are going to be a phoneme tier and a phase tier. And I want that phase tier to be a point tier, which means that we can write on a line instead of between 2 lines. Essentially, I'll shift click to select them both, view and edit. And let's zoom in and then scroll through them. I'll shift click. I can press Control N on a PC, Command N on a Mac, or this select button at the bottom. And I see, okay, these look nice. I see the burst here and I see the burst here, but it's pretty hard to identify any burst in that first section. So let's move over and see if the burst is more obvious. A little bit more obvious here, sure. I like number 2. Let's check out number 3. Oh, that's got some very nice bursts. Lovely. But wow, do you see that creaky voice at the end? How about here? Yeah, that's a fine burst. We see a quite messy beginning. I don't know what was happening at the beginning of my ah. I think number 2 was the best. Let's go back to number 2. Oh, this has a funny beginning as well. Curious. All right, so first thing we want to do is, since we know this already says, since we already know this says aber papa, we can go ahead and start by identifying our vowels. We know that vowels always have a voice bar and formants. So if I know this starts with an ah, this is probably something funny happening with my glottal stop. Let's listen. I'm curious. I sound like a croaking toad. Who knows? I'm not going to worry about the glottal stop for our purposes right now. Anyhow, let's shift click to select a whole section, and we see this is roughly where we get a sharp decrease in volume. So for our purposes right now, I'm just going to press enter and section that off, and we can worry about moving things around later as needed. Same thing here. We've got a nice big dark section. I'm just going to call that an ah, and when we come back to this, we'll worry about moving things around based on these plosives. Same thing here. Well, let's look at this last one first. Same thing here. We've got a nice, actually, here's a great example to notice something. We see that the voice bar begins here, but these higher formants don't begin until a little ways back. And that's a good sign that what's happening here is not a vowel, because if it were a vowel, it would have the formants up top. So I'm going to be cautious and say it's right here for now. Could I check? Yes. I'll do it later. Now let's go over to the trickier one. Now, why is this one tricky? Because we see this swoosh where things are changing from the p to the ah. That's because of co-articulation, right? 2 sounds happen at the same time. We do not speak like robots who produce just 1 sound at a time. So in this case, I would say this is definitely some kind of vowel beginning, because otherwise we wouldn't have a voice bar. But we still have a lot of this kind of Geräusch at the top that makes it not quite clear. So I think it's a little more vowel-y than it is plosive-y. So for our purposes, again, I'm going to count that as part of the vowel. So now that we've got our vowels roughly accounted for, the next step is, since these are plosives, let's find the burst. We said everything is dependent on the burst. Now, this burst is easy to see. Even if I zoom way out, I see where that burst is, because it's a huge dark vertical line. Here too, the burst is pretty easy to see. It's not quite as easy because we've got some light patches down at the bottom, but easy enough. And the one that's a little trickier is this guy. Now, why would this one be harder to identify? It could be because the voicing happens both before and after the burst. So it's a little harder to see a sudden vertical stripe of darkness when you've got darkness on both sides. Now, my guess, it looks to me like it begins roughly here. We do see a slight darkening before it, and we see a bit before it. So maybe it's here. Maybe it's here. Let's check them both. Let's see what this sounds like. Well, that works actually. Let's hear that. And let's hear this. It's indiscernible to my ear, which gives me a hint that it's probably this one. There's nothing important happening between these if I'm hearing the same thing on both. So I'm going to go ahead and notate it as being right here and say there's my burst. And now the question is, since we've identified the bursts, how do we tell the three apart? And if we think back, we recall that our voiced plosive has voicing that begins before the burst. Our voiceless has voicing that begins at the moment of the burst. And our aspirated has voicing that begins after the burst. So which one of these might be easy to identify? Well, I think this one is the easiest to visually identify. We see no voice bar before the burst. Again, even when zoomed out. We see no voice bar before the burst. We see no voice bar after the burst. It's quite a while until any voicing comes in, which tells us this one must be our aspirated bilabial plosive. So, again, since we said that the a begins here, I'm going to put this whole thing as our aspirated p, which I show with a little h on the p. Now, could we say that some of this is the vowel and not the p? Yes, absolutely. We might go so far as to moving this like all the way over here. But we know that there is some articulatory motion in the p before the burst begins. There's the moment of closing the lips. So just a teeny tiny bit. The teeniest, tiniest, just so that we'll be able to see it. I'll keep it right here. And so if we listen to the ah, well, that's a bit funky, huh? So we did get the burst there at the start, it sounds like. Let's move this back even farther and see what we get. I don't know what we're getting here at the end. That's definitely not the burst yet. Just my computer being funny, I guess. So the burst is happening here at some point. We know that there's some burst here. May as well move over to this one next. Which one is this? Well, we see a voice bar before the burst, which means it can only be the voiced plosive. And again, could we say that the ah actually continues? Yeah, probably. How far? I don't know. We would have to measure it a little more precisely, but I'm going to say roughly here because we see some formants starting to come in and be a bit different here. So let's try that and see what it sounds like. Let's isolate. Sounds like a b to me. So we have aba, pa, ba. Now, if we said the burst is right here, and we're looking at the bottom to notice the voice bar, it seems that there is a voice bar on the right, but there is not a voice bar on the left, which tells us it is voiceless. So, and again, yet again, could we move this ah over? Yeah, we could move it almost all the way over, in fact. But we do see there's a differentiation, and this time is kind of showing us when the lips start closing to create the p. That co-articulation means that no matter where we put this line, it's never going to be a perfect representation of what's happening. So for our purposes, I'll move it to just before the burst. So there you go. Now we have seen how to identify plosives that are voiced, voiceless, or aspirated in Praat. Great job, guys. Bye.